So hello everyone. Today we are going to continue our series of lectures on Christianity. This one will be about Protestant Reformation, and we will be focusing on Martin Luther as the founder of the Protestant Reformation. But I will also tell you about the general chronology of Protestantism and also about other forms of Protestant reform. First, let me give you a brief chronology of the most important events that are associated with Protestant Reformation. We will begin with the year 1418. That was the year of the end of the so-called Western Schism. The Western Schism that lasted for less than a century was that period in the history of Catholicism when there were more than one person pretending to be the legitimate pope, leader of Catholicism. First, there were two contenders, and then there were three contenders. That was a very difficult situation for the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church was able to resolve it. But still, this event showed that the Catholic Church was in crisis, and the Western Schism may have been one of the reasons for the criticism of the Catholic Church by Protestant reformers later on. The formal beginning of the Protestant Reformation dates back to the year 1517. And this beginning of the Reformation is connected with the name of Martin Luther. In 1521, when Martin Luther formulated the basics of his views, when he kept criticizing the Catholic hierarchy, he was summoned to the so-called Diet of Worms. The idea behind this diet was to accuse him of heresy and deliver him to the Pope, to the Inquisition. And in this case, his life would not have been spared. But not only Luther did not take back his views, but he was not delivered to the Inquisition and was able to leave the city. And I will tell you later how and why did this happen. 1530, the next important year in the development of Lutheranism, one of the trends within the Protestant Reformation. In 1530, the followers of Luther gathered in the city of Augsburg in today's Germany and formulated the so-called Augsburg Confession of Faith, which is the summary, this ideological summary of the Lutheran Confession. In 1534, King Henry VIII, the King of England, broke away from the Catholic Church and declared himself the head of the Church of England. That marked the beginning of the Reformation in England. Also in 1534, the Catholics responded to the growing influence of the Reformation by establishing the Order of Jesuits. The specific task the Order of Jesuits was entrusted was to fight, of course, ideologically, to fight Protestant ideas. Now, since Protestantism was viewed as a threat, not only in the area of religion, but also in the area of politics, theology was not the only field in which Protestants and Catholics clashed with each other. In 1555, fortunately, the actual military actions between Catholics and Protestants was avoided, and they signed the so-called Peace of Augsburg. In 1563, Another brand of Protestant Reformation, which is known as Calvinism, issued its own summary of beliefs. It is called Heidelberg Catechism, and it was accepted by the followers of John Calvin in the city of Heidelberg, now in Germany. And finally, another very important date in the Protestant Reformation and in the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation is 1563. In 1563, the Catholic Church Council of Trent, which is known in the history of Catholicism as the Council of Counter-Reformation, finished its proceedings. The Church Council of Trent lasted from 1545 until 1563, and it laid the foundation of Reformed Catholicism. That is a brief chronology of the events that were taking place in the 16th century and that were related to the rise of the Protestant movement. As I said in my previous lectures, from the very beginning, Christianity was suffering from many schisms, dissenters, from heresies, and therefore the rise of Protestantism as one of those heresies in the eyes of Catholics was not something radically new. But there have been some serious reasons for the Protestants to arise and to criticize the Catholic Church. What were those reasons? Number one, by the 15th and the 16th century, Europe saw the rise of national monarchies. And at the top of the national monarchies were the kings. And the kings did not want to offer a significant portion of their powers to the church, and more specifically to the Pope. So the constant struggle and the constant rivalry between the popes and the secular kings, between the Catholic Church and the national monarchies, served as one of the reasons for the success of Protestantism. Number two, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church was enjoying a lifestyle that was very far from the lifestyle of Jesus. And this lifestyle of excessive luxury and pomp was the target for Protestant criticism, and a successful target. As I said in the beginning, the Great Schism, when the Catholic Church could not select the Pope, and there have been several contenders, first two contenders, then three contenders, also served as an indication that the Catholic Church was weakening, and there is some kind of vacuum of power, and Protestant reformers definitely use this vacuum. Next point, as I told you in one of my previous lectures, one of the characteristic features of medieval society was the existence of monastic orders. Monastic orders were a constellation of various monasteries led by an abbot who was directly subordinated to the Pope. Those monastic orders functioned pretty much as non-for-profit organizations today, and they were involved in fundraising. There was a popular proverb at the time: one would do better meeting a robber than a begging friar. And finally, the practice of indulgences. What were indulgences? The Catholic Church taught that there is a reciprocity between this world and the world to come. So therefore, when you do something good and charitable, not necessarily donating the money, but when you volunteer to do some work in the name of, let's say, your relative, You may help this relative in the purgatory. You may alleviate some of the sufferings that your relative may be going through in the purgatory. That was the teaching, and there was nothing wrong with this teaching because it stimulated good work, encouraged good work, and selfless devotion. However, back in the times of Luther, the practice of indulgences turned into another form of fundraising. The form of fundraising that was completely shameless, when people will tell you that if you donate some money to the church, then you may save your relatives from the pain in purgatory. Basically, a spiritual blackmail. Let's say how it is, the spiritual blackmail and the fundraising. So Martin Luther, as well as later reformers, rebelled against the practice, not against the theory, not against the theology behind the practice, but they rebelled against using the theology of indulgences simply for shameless fundraising. Now let's turn to the founder of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. On the right image, you see the Augustinian convent where he was spending his time. He lived most of his life in one city, or rather a small town, the town of Wittenberg in Germany. And this is the convent where he actually spent his nights. Martin Luther became an Augustinian monk in 1505. He was ordained a priest in 1507. He became the chair of biblical exegesis in 1513. Now, exegesis means interpretation. He was professor of biblical interpretation, and he held this post for the rest of his life. If someday you travel to Germany and you will find yourself in Berlin, then you can go to a train station and take a train that in 50 minutes will arrive in the town of Wittenberg. Just make sure this is the right Wittenberg. And the right Wittenberg is called Wittenberg Lutherstadt, Wittenberg, the city of Luther. And when you look at this town, you will see that it is very small. It has only one main street. This is the main street of Wittenberg. It is called Kollegienstrasse, and this is the beginning of the street. And the convent, when Luther was living, is right behind the beginning of the street. Then, if you follow the street to the end, you will see the church where Martin Luther was teaching the Bible, had classes, and the church where he nailed his famous 95 theses. Let us take a look at this church. This is the Wittenberg Church, where Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses, and this is the door where he did that. Original entrance was rebuilt, as I was told, but still very touching. And this is the inside of the church. Like many German churches, this church is very warm and full of light. Now, as you see to the building of the church, the tower is adjacent. And in this tower, there is a hall where Martin Luther delivered his lectures. While the church is still open for services and for public, the tower where Martin Luther was teaching is now a museum. So this is the hall in the tower, and this is the room where Martin Luther delivered his famous lecture, in which he challenged some of the interpretations and formulated the foundation of the Protestant Reformation. On the right side, you will see the hall where students were listening to Martin Luther, and here on the left side, you see the podium where Martin Luther was actually lecturing. This is his portrait, and these are portraits of other Protestant reformers. So how did the Reformation start? It started from Martin Luther's personal spiritual crisis. Martin Luther suffered from what we now call depression. But back then, it was called a spiritual crisis. He could not find peace of conscience. He was praying, he was fasting, he was doing vigils, confessions, and still inside himself he felt that he is sinful and that he is guilty of his sins, and that he will not be saved, that he will end up in hell. His spiritual crisis was caused by a craving for certitude about his own salvation. And that is very important, because this is the psychological origin of what we know as the movement of Protestant Reformation. He was not certain that he is saved, in spite of the fact that he was not only a Christian, but he was a monk, a priest, a professor of biblical exegesis, that he was doing everything he could as a good Christian. Still, he had doubts about his afterlife. Now, if you are going through a spiritual crisis nowadays, you will be advised to get an appointment with a psychologist or psychotherapist, or if you are in bad shape, with a psychiatrist. But back then, psychology, psychiatry was not as developed, and Martin Luther had to overcome this crisis by himself. And the only instrument of overcoming the crisis for him was theology. After all, that was his profession. So in one of his lectures, Martin Luther was talking about the letter of the Apostle Paul to Romans, and he was focusing his lecture on chapter 1, verse 17, that read, "The just shall live by faith." In traditional Catholic theology, this sentence was understood in terms of the retribution theology. Just means justice. Justice of God means the justice by which God punishes the sinners. That was the usual theology, not only of the medieval times, but of biblical thinking in general. Retribution is one of the main ideas in the Bible. If you do good, you will be rewarded. If you do bad, you will be punished. So the justice of God is referring in this context to punishment, because not many of us actually deserve a reward. And that interpretation brought pain to Martin Luther, because inside himself, he believed that he was a sinner. And therefore, justice in this case for him meant punishment. And in the end result, hell. However, in his lecture, he provides a new interpretation of this very sentence: "The just shall live by faith." He reinterpreted justice to mean justification through faith. In other words, justice is not about God's justice and punishment, but it is about God's judgment, judgment about who is worthy of salvation. And whoever is worthy for salvation is justified through faith. Now, that, of course, will lead eventually to the Protestant idea of predestination, because if our free will have nothing to do with our salvation, if our personal efforts have little, if anything, to do with our afterlife, then it's up to God to choose or to predestine who is going to heaven and who is going to hell. So the idea of predestination, as a result of this initial formulation of Protestantism, will become the cornerstone of the Protestant movement. But at that time, Martin Luther was preoccupied with his own salvation. And this reinterpretation of the sentence, "the just shall live by faith," relieved him of his crisis, because he realized that there can be certainty about personal salvation. And the certainty comes only through faith. Some people have faith, other people do not have faith. But if you have faith, real faith, faith in your heart, it means that God justified you through his grace by delivering you from the faithless state, and it is your faith that ultimately will atone your sins, will redeem you. And Martin Luther did have faith, so therefore this reformulation of one verse in the chapter 1 of the letter of Paul to the Romans actually helped him overcome his spiritual crisis. So let me reiterate. According to Martin Luther and his newly found theological position, justice is not about God's retribution, but it is about divine judgment, whether the person is worthy or not worthy of salvation. God judges some people to be worthy of salvation by his uncreated grace that he delivers to this person. And the doctrine of justification by faith, hence, became the starting point and the cornerstone of the Reformation theology. Now let's talk about the implications of this view. So Martin Luther started by arguing that the only true certainty about one's salvation comes through faith. And what does this mean? What is the origin of faith? Well, the origin of faith is obviously Jesus Christ for Christians. But where can you find information about Jesus Christ? In the Bible, in the sacred scriptures. So hence, the sacred scriptures have the supreme authority and are the source of salvation in Protestantism. Martin Luther realized that the sacred tradition, in his case the Catholic sacred tradition, which represents a series of interpretations and reinterpretations of the Bible, could and should be questioned, because the tradition is not the source of salvation and faith. The tradition is simply the result of rational reasoning of human beings. And only God could deliver a person from sin. So therefore, it is the Bible, and only the Bible, that is the source of salvation. What's next? Since the Bible is the source of salvation, then it should be available to all people. And in the times of Luther, Catholics used a standard translation of the Bible into Latin that was made in the 4th century by Saint Jerome. This was an excellent translation. But this was a translation into Latin, and Latin was not the language of the common people. There have been many attempts to translate the Bible from its original languages, which are Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, into the language of the common people, into, let's say, English or other European languages. But those attempts failed, and some of those people who were trying to do that were burned at the stake. The Catholic Church was in control of the translations and actually prohibited the translations of the Bible, unauthorized translations of the Bible. So for Martin Luther, it was very important to translate the Bible into the German language. And that's what he did. Fortunately, he knew the languages. He was the professor of biblical exegesis. So it took him several years, and it was a heroic action, but he produced the first completed translation of the whole Bible from its original languages into the German language in the 16th century. Plus, he argued that scriptures mean what they say, and the Bible should be accessible to the common people without any sophisticated and subtle interpretations. In the Catholic Church, Catholic theologians were following St. Thomas Aquinas, who was arguing that the Bible is a very sophisticated book with many layers of meaning. So when you read it, when you study it, you have to extract those levels of meaning: literal meaning, historical meaning, symbolic meaning, spiritual meaning. Martin Luther instead was saying that the Bible means what it says what it means, and any person could read it and understand very easily the message of Jesus. Now, as a result of those developments, Martin Luther realized that what the Bible teaches, what the New Testament teaches about the church organization and the church rituals, does not correspond to the practice of the Catholic Church. For example, when it comes to the church organization, the New Testament tells us that in the beginning, Christianity did not have priests. Why? Because Christianity was competing against paganism and Judaism, and both Judaism and paganism had priesthood, the institution of priesthood. So Christianity was trying to distance itself from those religions. And we read in the New Testament about deacons, elders, but not priests. So Martin Luther then is getting rid of the priesthood in his confession, in Lutheranism, and makes the church to be the organization of the believers who are equal to each other. He produces a new conception of the church as the priesthood of all believers. Everyone is equal. Now, what about the rituals? If you read the Gospels, you will see that in the Gospels, only 2 Christian rituals are mentioned explicitly. This is the baptism, when Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan by John the Baptist. And the second one is the Last Supper, when Jesus was celebrating the Jewish feast of Pesach with his disciples. Now, these are the 2 Christian rituals, the ritual of baptism and the ritual of the Holy Communion. There is no mentioning about other rituals. So Martin Luther, in his denomination, is getting rid of most of the rituals. And in fact, Those rituals are not called sacraments because there are no priests to perform them. And he leaves only baptism, which is the ritual of initiation into the Christian church, and the Holy Communion, which is the most important ritual in Christianity, and of course, marriage, which is a social ritual. So as a result, the service in the Lutheran Church is becoming different. There is no Mass to perform, there are no priests to perform the Mass, and the sermon becomes the center of the church service in Protestantism because the sermon demonstrates the significance of the Bible in personal salvation. So people should hear passages from the Bible on a weekly basis in order to understand the book. The Catholic Church was very slow to respond to Martin Luther's challenge. Yes, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Church of Wittenberg, but he did not have any intention to split from the Church or to create his own religion. He was a reformer. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church. He was ready to polemicize. He was ready to have a disputation with Catholic theologians. But the Church, as I said, was slow to respond. And finally, in 1521, Martin Luther was summoned to the Diet of Worms. Now, let me tell you briefly about the Diet of Worms and what that meant. By the way, the image here shows that moment when Martin Luther actually arrives and shows himself before the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and the other prince electors. Martin Luther is on the right side, and he is saying his famous words that here I stand. He refused to reject his views. He said that he would be ready to dispute and to discuss his views with anyone, and if anyone convinces him that he is wrong, he would readily accept that he is wrong. So what was the Diet? The Holy Roman Empire had a legislative organ. It was called the Diet, and it consisted of 3 chambers. The highest chamber included the so-called prince electors, 7 prince electors who made decisions by consensus and secret voting. Now, remember that the Holy Roman Empire was like a patchwork. It included more than 200 small states, and the ruler of the state was called the prince. However, among those more than 200 states, there were 7 rulers or 7 princes who had the right to elect the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So it was those prince electors who were part of this highest chamber of the Diet, along with the emperor. The emperor summoned Martin Luther, and the plan was basically to condemn him as a heretic and to hand him down to the Inquisition of the Catholic Church. However, prince electors were making decisions by consensus and secret voting. And if only one person abstains from the vote, then the whole chamber could not condemn anyone. And that's what happened. One out of those 7 princes, Frederick III, or the Wise, Prince Elector of Saxony, where Martin Luther was living, abstained in the vote. And therefore, this commission was not able to condemn Luther and to deliver him to the Inquisition. According to the rules, the emperor allowed Martin Luther to leave the city. He gave him 24 hours, but he warned him that after 24 hours, Martin Luther will be proclaimed a heretic, will be excommunicated from the church, and will be on the run from the imperial police as well as from the church inquisitors. Now, Frederick III, or Frederick the Wise, was fully aware of what awaits Martin Luther. So when Martin Luther was coming home, on the way to home, Frederick snatched him, not Frederick himself, but Frederick's army that was dressed as a group of bandits. They snatched him and they put him in one of Frederick's castles, where Martin Luther spent next 2 years. Basically, Frederick III saved Luther's life, allowed him to complete his project, scholarly project of the translation of the Bible, and that's why the movement of Protestant Reformation was actually successful. In addition to Martin Luther, there were other Protestant reformers, and let me mention the most important of them. Ulrich Zwingli was a reformer in Switzerland. Unfortunately, he died young in military battle against Catholics, but he developed his own Reformation views, and there was a time when he met Luther. He wanted to discuss with Luther their views, and they agreed on pretty much everything except for the idea of the Eucharist or the Holy Communion. Later, I will tell you exactly what was their disagreement about. John Calvin was a French reformer who ended up to be the main pastor in the city of Geneva, also in Switzerland. John Calvin is extremely important in the history of Protestantism because in the city of Geneva, he was able to establish a school, a theological school for Protestant reformers from all over Europe. So John Calvin made Protestantism an international movement. And finally, Henry VIII, whom I already mentioned, started the Reformation in England, but this Reformation was of a different kind. As you may know from history, Henry VIII was not able to have a son. His wife would not give birth to a son who would inherit his throne. And that's why he asked the Pope for a divorce. However, the Pope refused to grant divorce to Henry VIII, and it was a dilemma for him, either go with the church, but not be able to leave his throne to his child, or to leave the church and remarry and try to have a son. And that's what he did. He broke away from the church. However, ideologically, he was a Catholic. He did not change much. The rituals were still the same. The priests were there. So the Reformation in England followed a different pattern if we compare that with Germany or Switzerland. And finally, a couple of words about various Protestant denominations. As a result of the spread of Protestantism, there arose four main brands of Protestant denominations. The first one is Lutherans, the followers of Luther. The next one are Calvinists, the followers of John Calvin. In England, they were called Puritans. In France, they were called Huguenots. And also, in addition to Lutherans and Calvinists, Protestant Reformation produced sectarians and Unitarians. Who were sectarians? Sectarians were people who would focus on one particular idea they disagreed with the Catholic Church. For example, Baptists. This is mainstream Protestantism nowadays. Baptists disagreed with infant baptism. Baptists thought that people should be baptized as adults when they understand the meaning of this ritual. Also, Anabaptists or rebaptizers believed that people who were baptized in the Catholic Church are still not Christian and they have to be baptized again. And there have been many sectarians, for example, Quakers in the United States, also sectarians that focused on their peculiar to them theology and practice. As for Unitarians, these were the Christians who denied the Trinity. They believed that Christians are monotheists because there is only one God. And since there is only one God, therefore Jesus is not God. He's a special person, he's a Messiah, he may be even divine, but he is not God with the capital G. That's why they call themselves Unitarians. And finally, let me briefly talk about the doctrinal issues that were rejected by Protestants. This would be a brief comparison between Catholic and Protestant theological tradition. So first, Protestant, starting with Luther, rejected sacred tradition and apostolic succession. What is the idea of apostolic succession? It is the idea according to which Jesus selected his own disciples himself and entrusted those disciples with spreading the teaching, while distinguishing Peter from other disciples as the prince of the apostles. On this idea of the apostolic succession, the Catholic Church built their power, and the following ideas of papal primacy and infallibility follow from this view of the apostolic succession. And we discussed that already when we were talking about early Christian church. So the idea of apostolic succession, papal primacy, and infallibility are closely tied together, and it could be called the sacred tradition. So Protestants rejected this whole thing. And Martin Luther, after he was already excommunicated from the Catholic Church, went as far as to proclaim that the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon, that is mentioned in the book of Revelation, and that the Pope is actually the Antichrist. So moving forward to Christian sacraments. As I said, since Protestants rejected the sacred tradition, they also rejected most of the sacraments. And in fact, those Protestant denominations who got rid of the priesthood even rejected the idea of the sacrament. The two main rituals became the cornerstone of Protestantism: baptism and the Holy Communion. Now to the concept of transubstantiation. Remember Ulrich Zwingli and Martin Luther, their meeting, and the fact that they disagree on one issue. This issue was the issue of transubstantiation. So what is transubstantiation? According to Catholic doctrine, when the Holy Communion is being prepared, the bread and wine are mysteriously transformed or transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. They change their substance. That's what the word transubstantiation literally means. And when the Catholic believers partake of the bread and wine, they in fact partake of the body and blood of Christ. Both Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli rejected this view as simply a prejudice. Ulrich Zwingli was more radical than Martin Luther. He thought that nothing is transformed into anything, that bread and wine are still bread and wine, and that the Holy Communion is simply a ritual of remembrance. When the believers remember this Last Supper, when Jesus was sharing a meal with his disciples. Martin Luther also rejected the Catholic notion of transubstantiation, but he still believed that the body and blood are present. They are present not in the bread and wine, and the bread and wine are not transformed into anything else. He believed that in the Holy Communion, bread and wine are accompanied spiritually by the body and blood of Jesus. So imagine material and spiritual worlds running in parallel to each other. So when physically the believers consume bread and wine spiritually, they also consume the body and blood of Christ. And that view, which was the view of Martin Luther, was called co-substantiation. Now, a couple of words about Mary, the mother of Jesus. The Catholic Church venerates Mary, the mother of Jesus, as a unique person in human history. And this veneration, in terms of theology, has two aspects: the idea of perpetual virginity and the idea of the Immaculate Conception. Catholics believed that Mary gave birth to Jesus while being a virgin. But not only that, they also believe that Mary did not give birth to any other children, that she remained a virgin. And Catholics also believed that to be a mother of God, Mary should have been a special person. She should have been born without the original sin. And that's what the concept of the Immaculate Conception stands for. According to Catholic theology, only two people in history were born without the original sin: Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus himself. Now, needless to say that Protestants reject both ideas. They do believe that Mary gave birth to Jesus while being a virgin, but they say that the Bible talks about Jesus's brothers, James, for example, and maybe sisters. So therefore, Mary may have given birth to other children. So therefore, she did not remain a perpetual virgin. And finally, what about the afterlife? Heaven, hell, and purgatory. Protestants reject the idea of purgatory as not being explicitly stated in the Bible, but they still believe in heaven and hell. However, in Protestantism, when it comes to the afterlife, the most important idea is the idea of predestination, the doctrine of predestination, that represents a natural implication of the origin of Protestantism, which is about certainty, about one's personal faith. So the doctrine of predestination is what Protestants introduced into the Christian notion of the afterlife. And it is this doctrine that we are going to discuss next time, when I will tell you how Catholics responded to predestination, and when I will be telling you about the original sin and the limitations of human free will. And that concludes our today's lecture. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.